Welcome to Sachs Realty's Tuesday Night Podcast, where we talk about anything and everything real estate. Each week, we deliver expert information enabling you to make better informed decisions while keeping more money in your pocket. If you're interested in real estate, this is your show. Welcome to our Tuesday Night Live. And this week, we have an amazing guest, a very special guest, Peter Schiff. And as anyone that is following our channel, you've probably noticed that we have podcasted with him recently. Video is doing really well, has almost 700,000 views. And our last video prior to that, when I went out to Puerto Rico, Peter was so kind to have Joe and myself to his home where we sat in his living room and had a great show. And we're over 1 million views on that. So we just knew that this would be such a great thing to bring to you guys so that you could ask Peter your questions. And we're going to dive in tonight and talk about a lot of different things, mostly about the economy. It's not going to be so much real estate tonight, even though there's a lot of big news in the real estate world with NAR trying to settle for $418 million, that lawsuit that the federal judge still needs to sign off on, and what implications that will mean to buyers, sellers, brokers, real estate agents. It will be a game changer, I feel, in this industry. Peter actually worked on Wall Street, and he saw a lot of change in that business as well back when, the internet kind of took out stockbrokers. But anyway, Melissa, thanks for hanging in there with us almost 3 years on these Tuesday Night Live shows every week.
It's great. This night is extremely important and special for us here. Peter, thank you so much for being our guest this evening. Everyone, please let Peter know your comments and questions. I'm going to be feeding them to him. And looking forward to a great show this evening.
Peter, welcome.
Oh, thanks, Todd, for having me on your program.
Absolutely. A lot of people have been asking, like, who is Peter Schiff? I mean, for those that don't know you, and I don't mean like, who is Peter Schiff, the adult version of Peter Schiff. I'd like to know, tell everybody, who is Peter Schiff? What were you like growing up? Where did you grow up? I mean, you live in Puerto Rico now, but just kind of give us a overview of Peter Schiff as a kid and growing up, and sort of like your walk to where you are right now.
I don't know. I mean, I grew up, I guess like an ordinary kid, although, my parents were divorced at an early age. So from when I was about 5 years old, I lived with my mother. My mother moved us around quite a bit. She got some child support from my dad back then, but not quite enough. And I don't think she got any alimony. So she had to work, and so we moved around quite a bit for her work. And so we didn't stay in one place. We were in Connecticut, then we were down in Florida, then we were in New York, then we went out to California. And I stayed out in California from the end of high school all the way until 2004. I graduated high school in 81, so I was in California from 1980 to 2004. Then I moved to Connecticut, and I stayed there. We still, I still have the house in Connecticut, but we moved to Puerto Rico from Connecticut in 2017, and I've been here ever since. But my economic philosophy was shaped by my father, who was a free market libertarian, Ayn Rand kind of guy. Barry Goldwater, Republican, very active in politics. Eventually became very active in the tax protest movement. He really was like the godfather of that movement, and paid a heavy price because he spent a lot of time in jail. In fact, he died in jail at the age of 87. But wow. I mean, I owe him a lot for the knowledge that I have and the perspective that I have on the economy, on money, on the U.S. government, things like that. So that might be the only thing that's a little bit atypical in the way I grew up, in that I did have not a very typical father. When my mom, my parents were divorced at a time where not a lot of parents got divorced. So, I mean, they were kind of trailblazers in divorce, getting divorced in the early 1960s. Because initially I remember very few of my friends were divorced. I was like one of the only kids whose parents were divorced. Of course, now it's very common. And by the time I got to high school, there were a lot more people that were from, divorced homes or things like that.
So your dad, I mean, the influence, I mean, it's very interesting because it sounded like you traveled around with your mom, moving from place to place, but you had this, relationship with your dad that was very influential. What was what do you think really stuck out about him where, because we think a lot alike and, you look there, anytime people speak their mind and speak what's not popular and speak what a lot of people are just quite honestly afraid to speak because of cancel culture or whatever, something gave you a deep courage. I mean, do you think that was 100% your dad? At what point can you pinpoint a time when you were young to where you were like, yeah, this guy speaks up. I mean, this is who I want to be. Or
I think it's hard for me to know, how I would have thought without my dad's influence, if I would have come to a lot of these revelations and this type of understanding on my own. I credit my dad a lot because he didn't have the benefit. His father was, a socialist. And so, my dad had to learn everything on his own. And he was, the oddball out in the family, and being, grew up Jewish in New Haven. Everybody was Democrat. Very far left back then. So, my dad had to do all on his own, and whereas I had the benefit of him teaching me. So I have no idea, but I think a lot of other people have been able to, go through this journey on their own. They start out when they're young, very idealistic, and they embrace a lot of these socialist ideas because maybe they sound good. But as people mature and they develop their intellect more than just their emotions, and they start to realize that a lot of the things that they thought, were good were actually very bad. And a lot of the problems that they were hoping to solve with government, they discover that government actually caused those problems, and the government solutions actually make them worse.
But you watched what happened when someone went against that. I mean, your dad was put in prison because of it, I mean, did that make you angry back then? I mean, was it more motivation, or was it a combination of both anger and motivation?
I don't know that I was like, trying to get revenge or, for what the government did to my father. Although, they up until they stole my bank from me, they pretty much left me alone. I mean, I'd had, no real run-ins with the government. I think I only had one audit in my life, which was, bizarre because I have a high income. But the one time they audited me, they didn't get any extra money out of me. So maybe they figured that I was pretty clean. So they didn't come back. But up until what happened with the bank, they haven't really tried to, maybe exact any penalties on me for the sins of my father. Although I don't believe my father sinned. I think my father was a very honest, very courageous man who stood, on his principle. He did not believe he was violating the law. I think it was the government that was wrong in the sham trial, that they held. And I think my father, for all practical purposes, was a political prisoner. I don't think he was in prison because he intentionally did anything wrong. I think the government put him in prison to make an example of him and to try to send a message to other people not to follow in his footsteps.
Yeah. There's I want to talk a little bit about I guess the divide that we have today, because I mean, you and I, we've had a lot of discussion on the economy and how bad it is and how debt is, it's terrible. Consumer debt, government debt, deficit spending. but yet we somehow there has been this infiltration that has sort of imposed this animosity, this anger amongst humans, people, citizens, US people, to where you're either on one side or the other, and they don't even know why they're fighting a lot of times. But I mean, we have, you know, an election year that's upon us, and we have two figures, Trump and Biden, and it's like if you like one, the other people hate you. If you like the other one, the other people. I mean, there's like a divide that we've never seen before, where, you know, the politics were politics and everybody would shake hands across the aisle and go to their cocktail parties and do this and that. But now it seems like it's just pure hate.
Yeah,
what's your take on that?
It's much more divisive now, even though, you know, practically speaking, if you look at Trump and Biden on the big issues, they pretty much agree. I mean, nobody wants to cut Social Security. No one wants to cut Medicare. No one really wants to cut any government spending. They don't want to cut the military. So, you know, we're just arguing about, you know, the fringes, you know, where they want to do. And, you know, and you would think that given that the candidates have a lot more in common than they have differences. But I think that's because the differences are so petty. We focus on them so much. And it's frustrating. But yeah, I've never seen it. I mean, I know I've seen now a lot of people like my mom who, you know, is, you know, Republican, conservative, and she's lost friends. I mean, friends she's had her whole life she can't even speak to anymore because of, you know, the politics. I mean, and these are friendships. Politics shouldn't even be getting into it. But I mean, I think the problem is the hatred that people have, I think, for the Republicans now, and particularly for Trump. And Trump is, you know, Trump is more of a populist even. He's not really a conservative. I mean, there's some things about Trump that I like. And I wish he was more, you know, of a Ronald Reagan, Barry Goldwater type, but he's not. But, you know, the problem is the Democrats are so convinced that they're right about all the things that they believe in. And if the Republicans don't believe in these things, it's because they're bad people, right? How could you be such a bad person? You know, how could you be so heartless and cruel if you don't believe in all these great things, noble things that we believe in? And typically, at least a Republican doesn't think the Democrat is a heartless or a bad person. They're just ignorant. They're just misinformed. They don't understand that the things that they think are good are actually bad. So normally it's easier for the Republican to be friends with the Democrat because the Republican knows that, you know, they mean well. They're not bad people. They're just really misunderstood and misinformed, and they just don't know any better. Whereas the Democrat thinks the Republican is just a bad person, you know. But now, I mean, even what it means now to be a Democrat, it's very difficult because all this, you know, political correct nonsense and, you know, the idea that there's no freedom of speech or freedom of expression. I mean, you have to toe the line on all of this nonsense that they want to, you know, put out there. Particularly, I've never seen anything like what's going on with the gender stuff. I mean, that just like is over the top. But you know, it's been moving in this direction. You know, they try to create these special classes of people where you get some kind of special privilege based on some, you know, some commonality, whether it's your gender, your sexual orientation, some physical disability you may have. And the politicians create these special classes, and now they say, oh, you get all these extra rights if you're a member of this class. And then they start advocating, you know, to you know, deliver these privileges to these class members and start punishing people, you know, if they claim that they've somehow discriminated against people who are in these favored political groups. And of course, they do that. They try to get their votes. They figure, well, if I can create this class, then everybody who falls into that class is going to vote for me, especially if I can convince that class that they're a victim and that they have no chance of success unless they vote for me, because, you know, it's all stacked against them. and they need government, to level the playing field.
Well, I think a lot of the divide also is from a capitalist perspective and a socialist perspective. And I want to play. I have a little treat here that I want to play. It's a little clip from you from 12 years ago. It was posted 12 years ago, and so we can just play this real quick.
Decide that, oh, why we pay someone $8 an hour if we can get someone for 50 cents an hour in India?
If you go back to the 1950s, for example, America paid the highest wages in the world, much higher than we do today. Yet we produced the cheapest stuff. Our products cost less than products produced anywhere else in the world, and so we sold them all around the world. Why? How was it that we could pay the highest wages but produce the lowest cost stuff? It was because we had more capital. We had more capital because we had lower taxes and fewer regulations.
What did you want to accomplish
So, Peter, from and this is according to the National Bureau of Economic Research, from 1982 to 1999, we lost 4 million workers due to offshoring our manufacturing. And by 2007, the share of offshore employment had reached 44%. Now, many believe that manufacturing offshore was one of the cheapest ways or the best things for us. However, since then, wage growth hasn't kept up with inflation. And since offshoring from the 1980s through 2020, workers' wages only grew by 17.5%. Yet housing costs, one cost, for example, rose 310%. So never kept up with the rate of wage growth. And yet when we talk to a lot of people, they look down on small business. They look down on, people, I've heard you say how you lived very conservatively. You built your business, you worked 20 hours a day. I mean, you got yourself to, you had over 100 employees. I mean, this is not easy. These aren't easy things to do. There's a lot of sacrifice that is involved in paving a path for people to make money, to earn paychecks. And small business actually is the largest employer here in the U.S. I mean, we've known that. I mean, they don't want to give credit to the businesses, but why do you think that the administrations, and I'm not just talking about this current administration, but why do you think it is that we have grown people to be so angry against capitalism and think that socialism is the right way for their well-being?
Well, it's, the politicians appeal to the lowest common denominator of people, their envy, their jealousy, their fears or insecurities. The hardest job you can have is to be an entrepreneur, is to be the owner of the business. Nobody works harder than the owner of the business, at least in the beginning. I mean, it's possible eventually that you could work less, but when you have a business, you don't punch a time clock. I mean, there's no weekend for you. You're working at night. When you're on vacation, you're working, and you don't get a salary. You may not earn anything. You may have to come out of pocket, because you only get paid if there's a profit, and there may not be a profit. It's much easier to be an employee. You just come in and do your job that you're assigned. You're told what to do, so you don't have to figure it out. You get told, and then you do what you were told, and you get a paycheck. And that paycheck comes every week, whether the company has a profit or not. So it's much easier to be an employee. Now, it's not as lucrative. You can't ultimately make as much money as the owner of the business, but he's taking a lot more risk and he's doing a lot more work. But the employees far outnumber the employers. And that's why the politicians are always catering to the employees, because there's more votes. It's like, they asked Willie Sutton, why do you rob the banks? Well, because that's where they keep the money. And so why do politicians pander to workers? Because they've got all the votes. And so they tell the worker, you're overworked, you're exploited, your boss is a mean guy who is discriminating against you and doing all these bad things. And so vote for me, and we're gonna get you higher pay and better benefits and better working conditions. We're gonna make that that bastard pay, right? And this works. And it's also too, I think, people who don't really appreciate capitalism are the ones that earn the least in a capitalist system, right? But they actually benefit the most from capitalism, and they don't even know it. Like, you take school teachers or people in the media, they don't earn a lot of money, right? These are not the highest paying jobs. But a lot of people that have these jobs think they're a lot more valuable than they are. And they're very resentful that other people who they don't think are doing jobs that are as important as the jobs they're doing, that they're getting rich. And they're not making all that money. And they don't appreciate the real difference and distinction that in capitalism, you get paid, in proportion to the contribution you actually make. And so these people just, think they're a lot more valuable than they really are. But they tend to be socialists because they just don't like the outcome, in that they see a lot of other people that are far more successful than they are. And they and rather than saying, well, it's because of the choices I've made and what I'm doing, they try to say, well, I'm just not mean, I'm just not greedy, I'm not ruthless, I'm a good person. And so that's how they kind of justify their own inadequacies or their own failures. But they express that. That's why, all the reporters, almost, they're all socialists, Democrats. And by and large, so are the teachers, which is a problem, because that's, where our kids are learning. They're learning in the government schools from a bunch of socialists. And then when they go into the mainstream media, they get their news, which, isn't really even news anymore. It's just outright, propaganda. They get all that from a bunch of socialists too. But the reason I said that these people benefit the most from capitalism is because their entire standard of living is based on the productivity and the success of entrepreneurs and capitalists who produce all the products that they buy and take for granted, and all the services. I mean, everybody's life is so much better because all these millionaires are out there creating stuff. The way people get rich is by satisfying the needs of the larger community. So you figure out what people need and how to make their lives better, and then you do it, and you get rewarded for your success. And the people that benefit the most from capitalism are actually the middle class and the poor. Their standard of living is far higher than it otherwise would have been without that system.
I've heard you with on other podcasts and talking about, and I don't know if it was you that directly said it, but you guys were talking about it in comparing the dollar to gold to Bitcoin and things like that. But somebody had said the people that are middle class and less income earners, they're all for printing money and stimulus, and what happens is the money is probably the only thing that other than helium, that defies gravity. I mean, it seems to go all the way up. A lot of people say that they look at it and they go, well, this capitalistic society that we're supposed to have, or all these billionaires and these mega CEOs, and that this money that gets printed just ends up in their hands. I mean, is there a lot of truth to that? I mean, is the system really rigged, though, to make these elitist or wealthy, or are you not talking about those? Are you talking about, kind of define the difference between the ones that are making it happen?
Yeah, well, a lot of people think the government, has what they need, that the government has the money because they print it. But when you're talking about a fiat monetary system, money itself, paper money, has no actual value. You don't want the money. You want the things that you can buy with the money. And the government doesn't produce any of those things. The private sector produces the things that you want. So it's the private sector that has what people need and what people want. And when the government prints money, right, they don't increase the supply of goods and services. All they do is they change the distribution of that production. And in the process, they cause prices to go up. Because when they print money and they give it to somebody who didn't earn it and did not produce anything, and they take that money and they try to buy goods and services that other people did produce, they end up bidding up prices. And so everybody else has to pay higher prices because some people got money they didn't earn. And we call that inflation. But the public doesn't understand that the source of inflation is government. And the government loves to print out money and give it to people because the people who are losing don't realize that they've lost. They don't realize that the budget deficits have to be paid, and they're being paid with inflation. And a lot of times, people don't even realize how high the inflation is because in a productive capitalist economy, the natural tendency of prices every year is to fall. So prices should be going down, and everybody should be benefiting from lower prices. And lower prices are a beneficial byproduct of capitalism and of productivity and efficiency. But the government robs the public of that benefit by creating inflation. And so when they make a big deal of it, oh, we want 2% inflation. Well, what if prices would have gone down by 3%, but instead they went up by 2%? Well, that's 5%. And that's a lot of money if the government took 5% of your purchasing power. And it's not 1 year, it's every year that they take this. But the public doesn't, have the objection to the taxation because they don't recognize it for what it is. And the government, to the extent that, the CPI even reveals the inflation, they always blame it on whoever's raising the prices. But when businesses are raising prices, they're not causing inflation. They're raising prices because of inflation. It's the inflation that caused them to raise prices because the government lowered the value of money by creating more of it. And when you have more money, the price of goods has to go up.
Well said. Debt. When we spoke last, you had said that I'd asked you if you thought that we would go through some kind of a depression like we experienced in 1929, and you said it could be worse. I don't think that people really realize just how bad things are out there. I mean, when we're looking at credit card debt the way it is, and people, it's funny because they're, and I don't mean this in a bad way, but people are, in the truest sense of ignorant, they're ignorant in many ways because they don't understand. They think, well, they may pay off their credit card every single month, and they believe that other people do it as well. But when we look at credit and to buy a house, and we see the unaffordability in America, and it's not one, it's 90% or 95% that can't afford it and 5% that can. So when we're looking at the masses, but yet they're the ones that defend it the most. They're the ones that argue it the most, that, hey, but yet they're in the deepest debt. I mean, tell us, what is the implications? What are the implications of where we really are right now, where we sit with this worst debt that we've had, the government debt? And how can, and just kind of, when people say, oh, it's doom and gloom, they want to say I'm a doom and gloomer, and they've said it about you too, because you're out there saying something that no one wants to admit the fact of. Look at your own credit card bill, people. Look at your car that you're paying $1,000 a month for the next 7 years that is depreciated now. It's tanked big time now that the pandemic is over. And so when you look at all these things, explain to people just how severe this debt crisis is and what could trigger that to make these really bad occurrences to set us back in something that most people have never experienced in their life.
Yeah, I mean, people don't appreciate the real phony nature of the prosperity that we enjoy because it's all a function of debt. Americans can't really afford the lifestyle that they have. The government can't afford the benefits that is promised. And the national debt, the $34.5 trillion national debt, that's an obligation of the American people. The people owe that money. The government has obligated them to pay that money. And that's just the tip of the iceberg, because if you look at the unfunded liabilities, it's a couple of $100 trillion that the Americans are on the hook for. And they're broke. I mean, Americans themselves are broke. How can they afford to pay their share of the national debt? So it is a gigantic debt bubble. And we have a completely, phony economy because we run $1 trillion a year trade deficits, which means our economy does not produce the things that we consume. And the only reason we're able to consume those things is because foreigners are willing to sell them to us. But what are foreigners getting in exchange for these products? They're getting our IOUs, because we're not exporting products to them like we should. It's a one-way street. Products come in, but they don't go out. And what we do is we give everybody an IOU, a US dollar. And, the world has been content to accumulate dollars as the world's reserve currency for decades now. But that is coming to an end. I mean, I think the world has already begun the de-dollarization process. I don't know how long it's going to take, but I think the end of the process is going to be very rapid. But we already see that foreign central banks are now significant buyers of gold. They've been continuously buying gold, and so they're doing that for a reason. They are replacing dollars with gold in their reserves, and so they are trying to prepare for a world where the dollar is not the reserve, and that's going to be a major change for America, because when the dollar collapses, which it will, then the price for everything that we buy. I mean, you think inflation is bad now. I mean, you ain't seen nothing yet. Prices are going to skyrocket for goods that we take for granted, because we don't produce them, and we won't be able to import them because we won't have exports to trade, because our economy is all service sector, and we can't export these services to Asia. We need factories. We need to produce actual goods, like we did at one time when we had a more legitimate economy that was based on savings and underconsumption, as opposed to a bubble economy, based on debt and consumption. But that's why I think this collapse will be a lot worse than the 1930s, because the U.S. economy is in much more worse shape now than it was in 1929. And it's because of years and years of being able to live in this artificial economy, where we're able to consume without producing and borrow without saving, all because the rest of the world does it for us. And we really take that for granted. We do not appreciate the extent to which our prosperity is dependent on the rest of the world. We kind of think it's the other way around. We think, oh, the world needs us because we consume all their products. No, we need them because they produce the products. They can consume the products themselves. They don't need us. The difficult part is making stuff. Anybody can consume the stuff after it's made. That's the easy part. That's the fun part. The hard part is building stuff and diverting scarce resources into the production process. And that's what we're not doing anymore.
I want to talk about something that, and you take a lot of criticism on this. There is a whole lot of you have a whole support network that believes in what you're saying, and I want to talk about gold, because as soon as we start talking about that, a lot of people are like, "Oh my gosh, here we go. We're going to talk about that gold thing again." And and Peter's just trying to sell gold and blah blah blah. But I want to hit the nail on the head, Peter, because there is a lot of and fairness to everybody. I just want to kind of, you taught me a lot that I didn't know. You told me that central banks were, because I'd said to you, how is gold hitting, the high? Because I don't know people going out and buying gold. And you said, well, people don't actually, it's not because of consumers. They end up buying it high and selling it low. It's actual central banks that are buying up the gold. And so just kind of explain that. And then I want to talk about a little bit, challenge you a little bit on why the gold, because a lot of people say, well, it's just older people talking about, gold. Like they're stuck in this time warp, and no one's going to have gold. It's all going to be digital currency, and it's going to be Bitcoin. And if you're not investing in that, I look at it as, I've had a conversation with somebody that said, look, I think it's on maybe Bitcoin's like in 7 or under 10 computer systems or whatever, or storage computers. I would think they could shut that down if they wanted to, but kind of let's have the gold conversation that no one really wants to talk about.
Well, I mean, gold is real money. I mean, gold's been money for thousands of years, and when the United States was founded and the Constitution was written, the framers made gold and silver money in the United States. Legally, the dollar was defined as a weight of gold or silver. That's what it was. And we didn't have any paper money until the Civil War, and that was only briefly, and that paper money was backed by gold. But the Constitution did not authorize the federal government to print money, and it prohibited the states from making anything other than gold and silver legal tender. So we were on a gold standard. The Federal Reserve didn't come around until 1913, but even then the Federal Reserve was a private bank. And so the government wasn't printing money, the Federal Reserve was. The Federal Reserve was private. It's still private. Even though the government, the president appoints the members of the FOMC, it's a private company. I mean, if you ever get a letter from the Federal Reserve, there's a stamp on it. Because they're not part of the government. You get a letter from a government agency, there's no stamp, but the Federal Reserve has to buy postage. The Federal Reserve also pays taxes to the U.S. government. Right? Government agencies don't pay taxes, so the Fed pays taxes. So it's a private banking syndicate, and that's the reason it's allowed to print money. Now, I still think what they're doing is unconstitutional, because I think they act as a de facto government, and I think they're circumventing the Constitution. But when the Federal Reserve Act was originally passed, Federal Reserve notes were backed by gold and silver, and in fact, they were redeemable in gold and silver. The note, right? When you say Federal Reserve note, what is a note? A note is a promise to pay, and so what Federal Reserve notes were is promises to pay. So if you had a $20 bill, you didn't have $20. You had the Federal Reserve's note, which obligated the Federal Reserve to give you a $20 gold piece. So it wasn't $20. And in fact, if you go and look at the early note, it doesn't say it's $20. It says Federal Reserve note, pay to the bearer on demand, $20. And so it was a liability of the Federal Reserve, and you can go to the Federal Reserve Bank and return that note, and they gave you a $20 gold piece, right? That was the dollar. The Federal Reserve note was the IOU for the dollars. And so that all changed really, initially with Roosevelt, but then for good with Nixon in 71. And we've been on this fiat monetary system. But the reason that I advocate gold is a superior store of value to paper currency. When the Federal Reserve was established, it was 20 Federal Reserve notes to buy 1 ounce of gold. Now you need more than 2,000 Federal Reserve notes to buy the same ounce of gold. So over that 100-year time period, the paper dollar has lost 99% of its purchasing power. So you now need 100 times more dollars to buy the same ounce of gold. But that wasn't the case. If you went back at the 100-year period from 1800 to 1900, the dollar was, you needed $20 to buy an ounce of gold in 1800, and the same $20 would buy an ounce of gold in 1900, right? So we didn't have inflation. We didn't have dollar devaluation, depreciation. So now I know that there's going to be massive inflation. And in fact, inflation in the future is going to be much worse than inflation in the past. So the dollar is going to lose a lot more value, going forward than it already lost. And so I advocate that instead of holding on to dollars, that you hold on to gold, because gold is a much better store of value. And I don't, sell gold. I don't have Schiff gold, and I don't go out and tell people to buy gold because I happen to own Schiff gold. The reason I started that company is because I believe people need to have gold. And in fact, when I originally was publicly advocating for gold ownership, I didn't have my own gold company. I was telling people to go out and buy gold. And what happened was I found out that they were getting ripped off because so many of these gold companies were pushing people into these numismatic coins, collectible coins. They were getting ripped off and paying these high markups. So I eventually formed Schiff Gold because I wanted to have a place to send people to buy gold where I knew they weren't going to get ripped off, and they would get, a fair price for their gold. But it's because I believe in it and I think people should have it. That's why I've got the business. It's not the other way around, that somehow I just happen to have this gold business and therefore I have to push people into gold, right? I have it because I believe in it. And I'm not selling people my own gold. No, I'm helping them buy gold from other people, right? Because I'm a retailer. I buy wholesale and I turn around and I sell retail. But I think that both gold and silver, particularly silver now, are undervalued. And so to the extent that you want to have savings, it should be in these currencies. Now, it's unfortunate because you don't really get any interest on your savings, but the interest you get in the bank is so low that it's not even worthwhile. And it doesn't even come close to offsetting what you're going to lose to inflation. And I think metals are undervalued. So I think you'll actually stay ahead of inflation. But I don't, advocate that people keep everything in gold. I mean, I advocate investments. The ones that I primarily deal in are stocks and bonds. I manage people's portfolios at Your Pacific Asset Management. So those are income generating investments, unlike gold. And the bulk of the money that I what I recommend is that people invest in productive assets. Not just gold, but gold is liquidity. Gold is savings. Gold is money. And so I recommend that people have that too, because maybe some of the stocks I own will go down. And if you have gold, well, you're in a position to buy them when they go down.
Well, I want to talk about the stock market a little bit because, a lot of people believe that is in a massive bubble and that, there could be a huge correction in the stock market. But let's talk about Bitcoin, because there's this argument, the government wants to know everything we have, right? And now they're, on the tax return, you have to check a box that says, do you have cryptocurrency, right? Dollars, if people have dollars under their mattress, the government doesn't know how much money they have, right? I mean, it's so people think that central banks, first of all, are all connected together, and that somebody was telling me that one central bank owns all of the banks in the world. I mean, you may be able to talk to that. I don't know if that's true. Is that true that there's one central bank?
No, they're independent. They're not. There's not one central organizer. But a lot of these central bankers, have a similar agenda, and so they tend to work, for mutual purposes, or and they all tend to be tools of, their governments. They're there to enable deficit spending, to enable politicians to avoid making any difficult choices that may endanger their reelection, by creating inflation and monetizing government debt. So the politicians love the central bankers because it makes it easier for them to get reelected.
Do you
But
think?
the public should not. I mean, the world is a lot poorer because of central banks.
Do you think there is this um, organization that wants a one, monetary system or monetary?
The New World Order. I'm sure there are some people that would aspire to, more central government for the whole world. But I don't think that's the real problem here. I think a lot of these governments are making these mistakes just because it suits their own political purposes to make them, and sometimes they don't even realize that they're making them. But you asked me about Bitcoin, so we might as well talk about it.
Yeah, because that's digital. I've heard that they
Yeah,
want to
look,
try and.
it's digital. That's for sure. It is digital, but it's not digital gold. I mean, it's counterfeit gold. It's fool's gold. The whole idea behind Bitcoin is that it's supposed to be some kind of digital alternative to gold, and they depict it like a coin, even though it's not a coin, right? It's just a string of numbers. But gold is a coin, so they make Bitcoin look like gold, and in fact, the color of Bitcoin is gold. And the way you create a Bitcoin is you mine it. Well, why do they call it mining? I mean, there's no mine, there's no picks and shovels. You mine Bitcoin by solving a mathematical equation. That doesn't sound like mining, but they use the terminology of mining to falsely create the impression that Bitcoin is gold. But it's not. It's not gold at all. It's just a string of numbers that exists, in the hyperspace. Right? And there's no real utility associated with it. I can't do anything with it. Yeah, I can send it to somebody else, and I can do it, securely. But there's 20,000 other cryptocurrencies that can say the same thing, and who knows how many more will be created in the future that can also do that. But I think a lot of people have gotten conned into this, Bitcoin Ponzi, pyramid, chain letter, however you want to call it. And one of the things that's really kept it going is that it has been a very successful scheme, because the people that bought into it early on made a lot of money. Bitcoin is, 60,000 a coin, more than 60,000. And it started out for pennies. So people made a tremendous amount of money. A small number of people made a tremendous amount of money because they got in when the price was very low, and they've gotten out along the way. Maybe they still have some, but they've been selling. But also more money came in, at 500 or 1,000, and they have big gains. But like all pyramids, eventually you end up with the bag holders, the people that come in at the higher prices, that end up losing all the money that the early adopters made, because that's what Bitcoin does. It transfers money from one group of people to another, because there's no real wealth associated with Bitcoin. I mean, no matter how many Bitcoin you create, you can't actually do anything. The world is not better off because we have 19 million Bitcoin. I mean, we can't produce any more goods or services because we have these 19 million Bitcoin than we could have produced when we didn't have any Bitcoin. And it doesn't really matter how many Bitcoin you have. I mean, you can't do anything with it. But there's a high price. And that's one of the things that people, confuse. They think Bitcoin has value because it has a price. No, it has a price because people want to buy it. Doesn't mean it has any value. But why do people want to buy it? Well, because they think it's going to go up. They think somebody else will buy it at an even higher price. Well, that works until you run out of buyers, because eventually you do. I mean, there's no way to keep this going indefinitely. Eventually, the people who have paper profits are going to want to realize those profits. They're going to want to buy stuff with their Bitcoin. But if there isn't another group of people willing to buy the Bitcoin from them, they can't, because the price will implode. But the idea that Bitcoin is some new form of gold that's superior to gold is just a bunch of nonsense. I mean, it's Bitcoin is no more digital gold than an image of food is food. You could look at food in a virtual reality program, but you can't eat it. You can't have a diet of digital food. You'll starve to death. You can have a beautiful house online, in a video game, but you can't live in it. It's not going to provide you with any real shelter. So there's a big difference between a digital image of gold and the actual metal. And that's what people forget. I mean, the reason that gold has value, it's not because we just say it has value. Gold is the most useful metal on the periodic table. That is a objective fact. And gold has been the most useful metal for thousands of years. And it's very scarce. So it's very useful and extremely scarce. That's what makes it very valuable. But it also has properties that Bitcoin copied that make gold good as money, in addition to being a very valuable commodity. But that's what money is. At its essence, money is the most liquid commodity. And money replaced barter. It was an evolution from a barter system to a monetary system where trade was a lot more efficient because you didn't need a coincidence of needs. Before there was money, you had a trade. So if I was a butcher and you were a baker, right? If I wanted to get your bread, I needed to trade you my meat. Well, what if you were a vegetarian? How am I going to get your bread? You don't want any of my meat. Right? So I had to find somebody who wants my meat, but maybe they didn't make bread. So it was very cumbersome. But if we have a commodity like gold, and I can pay the baker gold, and somebody can pay me gold for my meat, then we're just dealing with gold. But gold is a commodity, like bread, like wheat, or like cattle. Gold is an actual commodity. So if somebody gave me gold for my bread, I got something of real value in exchange. I got a metal that could be used. Even if I didn't need it, somebody else needed the gold to make something out of it, to do something with it. But Bitcoin, isn't a commodity, because you can't do anything with it. It doesn't have a use. It doesn't have, a purpose other than that, I'm going to buy it and I'm going to hope the price goes up because somebody else pays more money. So that it ultimately it can't work, and it's nothing like gold. And people think they're right because the price has gone up, right? Oh, Peter Schiff, you've been saying this for 10 years. Yeah, I have. I've been right for 10 years about the fundamental nature of Bitcoin. But while I've been right, so many other people who have been wrong have been buying it. And because the people who are wrong keep buying it, the price goes up. But that doesn't mean anything. I mean, yeah, if you sell, if you get out, then yes, you're going to make money off of other people's, greed and ignorance. But a lot of people are never going to get out. And so what difference is it going to make? So you're going to ride it up and ride it down. And at the end, you're going to have nothing to show for it.
Well, it's a good analogy. I mean, when I think about a stock, if you buy a stock of a company, they're making something, or they're providing a service or something that it can be expanded upon in a lot of cases, or, they have growth. But like you said, if this coin, this Bitcoin, it's not doing anything, it's not producing anything, the only reason you're making money is because other people, this phenomenon that people are just jumping into or paying more for it.
And the Bitcoiners make the mistake. They think, well, that's the same with any asset. No, it's not. When you own a stock, you own part of a business, and you have a share of the profits of that business. That's what. Now, it's maybe that business never makes any profits and eventually goes bankrupt, but you have a business that's striving to generate income for you. When you own real estate, you have the rental income of that real estate, or you can use it yourself, right? You can have a piece of property and you can live in it yourself, because we need shelter, we need a place to live. But if I don't use it myself, I can rent it to somebody else, whether it's residential or commercial, and I can collect rent because I own that asset. If I own a bond, I'm charging somebody interest. I'm getting interest on my money. So it's an asset. With a commodity, if I own a commodity, I own something that people need, right? If I own wheat, I own something that people are going to eat. There's an end user for my commodity. If I own gold, I have a commodity that a jeweler is going to need, or a chip manufacturer is going to need, or a dentist is going to need, or an aerospace company, because gold is actually used, or a central bank is going to need it because central banks use it as a monetary reserve for their fiat currency. So there's a lot of real world demand for gold that exists. But Bitcoin is not a commodity in that it doesn't have a use case independent of being a transfer unit. You can sell it, you can give it to somebody, but it doesn't have an actual use, right? I can give you my gold, but then a jeweler could actually use the gold and make a bracelet out of it, right? But nobody who has Bitcoin can decide to use it for something because you can't do anything with it. So it's not a commodity in that sense, and it's not an asset because it doesn't have any potential to generate any income, or it doesn't provide any real utility to the owner, like a piece of real estate would, because I can live there.
And if you lose your
And
key to your wallet,
if I own a house, I don't have to pay rent because I have a house.
Yeah. Well,
Save-
Peter, I
and
know
save on rent.
Melissa has been hard at work on these comments, and I know there are a lot of questions probably. So I'm going to turn it over to Melissa
Yeah.
and let the audience ask you some questions.
This live chat is on fire tonight. It's hot. And Peter, you've got some fans. Peter tells it like it is. I find his delivery to be tempered and rational. We also have another comment here from Jeff. Jeff, thank you so much. Love Peter Schiff, been following for years, buddy. The 9-minute video titled Peter Schiff Was Right is one of the best videos on the internet. So you've got a lot of fans here. It's hard to keep up, but we're going to start with this one. Peter, is it possible gold is part of the everything bubble? I ask because the real estate to gold ratio isn't much higher than the average and much lower than the mid 1970s when gold was massively undervalued.
Yeah, I don't think gold is part of the bubble. I mean, I think if you look at the price of gold today, it's basically maybe 10% higher than it was in 2011. So that's 12, 13 years ago. So the price hasn't really gone up over that time period. Silver is still half the price it was in 2011. It's half the price it was in 1980. So I think that gold and silver are not. I mean, they're the investment assets that are not in bubbles. It's everything else really that's in a bubble. It's all these highly speculative assets, NASDAQ type stocks or cryptocurrencies. That's where you have the bubble, and in so-called risk assets. And I also think there's been a bubble in bonds. Now, some of the air has come out of that bubble in the last couple of years, but I still think that bond prices have a way to fall.
Also wanted to follow up on that. I also want Peter to know he's a legend, a voice of sanity in an insane world. We had some Keynesian bankers here a few weeks back. I would have loved to see you debate. So thank you, David, for that. We also have another one here. Peter, why isn't anyone talking about the derivatives market? Seems to me that's the ticking time bomb that no one realizes how bad it will be.
Well, I mean, I think people do acknowledge the leverage that's in the system. And, when it comes to derivatives, the big issue is the counterparty and the risk there, and the risk that they've bitten off more than they can chew. I mean, that's what happened in the financial crisis of 2008. It was all these derivative instruments on mortgages that were a lot of the problem for the banks that were on the losing end of these transactions. But I mean, that's all part of the bubble. It's all part of the leverage that's inherent in the system. There are all sorts of commitments that have been made that can't possibly be kept. But so many people rely on those commitments, and they regard those commitments as an asset. and they're going to wake up to the reality that they don't have the assets that they thought. And then it's that's all hell breaks loose when people discover the truth. But right now, people are just living in a fantasy, and they think they have a lot of wealth that they don't.
Thank you. We have another question here, Peter, for you as well. Peter, are you pro gold standard only, or do you like bimetallism as well? Free market, age of exchange.
Well, we were in the U.S., as I said earlier, we were on a bimetallic standard. We used gold and silver, and of course, we also used copper and nickel, right? Because pennies were made of copper and nickels were made of nickel. So, I mean, money can be any liquid commodity. I mean, metals make the best money because you can make them into a coin, and then you know exactly how much of the metal is in that coin. So I think today, though, with digital economy, there's no real need for money to necessarily be coined. You can have bars of gold that can sit in vaults, and ownership can be traded, digitally. Whether it's in a crypto type currency with a blockchain or just through computers. There's more efficient ways to operate a gold standard today than there was hundreds of years ago. And in fact, when paper money was first introduced, it was because it was a more convenient way to be on a gold standard. We used these money substitutes that were backed by gold. But the government finds a way to corrupt that, which is what they did. But it doesn't matter as long as money is honest, as long as it's real, as long as it can't be conjured into existence by a government, as long as it represents an actual commodity. Then it can be a medium of exchange, and you can establish a pricing system because of relative value. How much is gold worth relative to oil, relative to wheat, soybeans, or any product that's out there? You can objectively allow the market to determine the relative value of two different commodities, and then you can have a price. Now, that's the problem with Bitcoin. Is Bitcoin doesn't have any ability to relate to any other product because it doesn't have a function.
I want to just interject here because you said something that was interesting. You mentioned that any other type of currency, and maybe even perhaps a Bitcoin or anything for that matter, fiat currency, if it were backed by real money, gold, that's fair play. But we know now that the banks take all of your deposit. I mean, you've said it, every bank in America is insolvent because if people went in to get their money, it wouldn't take many of those people before the bank.
Yeah, well, that's the fault of the government. But first of all, if fiat money is backed by gold, then it's not fiat money anymore. It's legitimate currency. The reason it's fiat is because it's not legitimate, because it's not backed by gold. But the reason the banks are so levered up is because of the government. The government insures all the banks. The government backstops them and allows them to keep a tiny reserve. But if there was no government guarantee, the banks would be forced through competition to hold a much higher reserve ratio of their deposits, because otherwise they wouldn't have any deposits, because customers would be too afraid to put their money in the bank. And so in order to create a sense of confidence among depositors, they would have to hold high enough reserves so that they can withstand a run. And that's what we had prior to the government involvement. In fact, even with the 29 crash and the collapse of the stock market, the 90% crash, and real estate prices crashing and banks failing, hardly any money was lost. I think about 2% of total bank deposits were lost in all the years of the Great Depression without any government insurance. I mean, we lose more than that every year now to inflation. So we had a much sounder banking system before Roosevelt screwed it all up by creating the FDIC. But the moral hazard implicit in this system is why the banks are insolvent today.
One of the scenarios that I've heard several people talk about is that there would be a massive consolidation in the banking industry, that maybe we would have 4 banks or 5 banks here in the US. And if you look at Russia, they have 450 banks. You look at the US, we have 4,500 banks. I mean, that number may be a little off, but it's a lot. It's a huge number, the amount of banks that we have here in the US. Some people say, well, maybe when you look at the bailouts and the government stepping in the GFC, but in 2023 with bailing out these banks, we would already be in a massive depression right now had the bank not bailed, or the government not bailed the banks out. But do you think there will ever be a scenario where the government would allow bail-ins, these banks to just implode and take people's money and only bail out the too big to fail banks?
Well, that's what they should do. I mean, they shouldn't be bailing out any of the banks. But politically, we already know what they're going to do. They're going to bail out every bank. But where do they get the money to finance the bailouts? It has to come from the Fed. They don't have any money. The Fed has to create it. We're already running massive deficits. So it's not like the government has budget surpluses that they can use to bail out banks. They have to go deeper into debt to bail out banks, and they're probably not going to find any lenders other than the Fed, which means the bank bailouts are financed through inflation, which is why, my advice to people is not to keep money in the bank, because you're going to lose no matter what the government does. Because there's 2 possibilities that can happen to your bank. It's either going to fail and the government doesn't bail it out, or it's going to fail and the government does bail it out, or the government bails it out before it fails to prevent it from failing. But either way, you get wiped out. So in the scenario where the bank actually fails, you lose your money because there's no money in the FDIC. So the bank fails, you lose your money. The bank doesn't fail because the government bails it out, your money loses its value because now inflation is going to erode away the value of your deposits. So one way or another, everybody with money in an American bank is going to take a huge hit. And so the best thing you can do is not hold money in the bank. Now you need some money in the bank to pay your bills and stuff like that, but you shouldn't keep any long-term savings in a bank account because you're guaranteed to lose. So you should take the money out of the bank and you should do something else with it. You could buy gold and silver with it. You can invest it in other assets, but you can't just leave it in the bank. You're just going to, go broke.
When you talk about the FDIC not having any money, I mean, obviously $250,000, I think, per depositor, maybe. I mean, per account. If you have a LLC or a personal account, maybe that accounts for both. When you're saying that if the bank fails and you're going to lose your money, do you believe that if this happens, it will be such a crisis that the FDIC just says we're out and we're not guaranteeing anybody's $250,000 deposit?
No, I mean, I think, look, that's what they did last year with some of these, Signature Valley Bank. And they didn't just bail out the $250,000 deposits. And by the way, before the 2008 financial crisis, that was $100,000. They raised it up to $250,000. But they bailed out everybody. If you had $10 million, you didn't lose anything, right? They decided not to let anybody lose any money, which at least even when they came up with the FDIC, they only insured a small amount of the deposits because they figured that if you were a larger depositor, that you were smart enough to shop around and keep the banks honest, But if nobody is shopping around, if no one gives a damn what the banks do with their money, then you're going to have, a over leveraged, reckless banking system, which is what we have. And now after 10, 12 years of 0% interest rates, we have a completely insolvent banking system. Every bank is going to need to be bailed out or they're going to fail. Even the biggest too big to fail banks cannot survive without government help. And unfortunately, they're going to get that help. And, that just means inflation. That just means the dollar is going to lose that much more of its purchasing power. And that's why you got to get your money out of the banks, and do something else with it, which is unfortunate because you want to have money in the banking system because that way it's available to make loans. A businessman can go and borrow some money to buy some capital equipment to help produce more goods or employ more people. The fact that we have to take our money out of the bank because if we leave it there, we're going to lose it. That's a negative for the economy. But I'm not going to ask somebody to sacrifice themselves just so there can be more money in the banking system. I mean, unfortunately, you lose. I mean, it's supposed to be a win-win. The banks are supposed to be able to pay you an honest rate of return for, putting your money, in that institution. So the saver is supposed to win. The borrower is supposed to win. But in the environment we have today, the saver is the patsy. The saver loses. And so you can't get involved in that transaction.
I remember back in the early 90s, maybe it was even the late 80s. I mean, I think I was getting like 6.5 or 7% of my money in the bank. I remember, getting my statements and being so excited because I was actually making money by having money in the bank. And now it's just like you said, it's just non-existent.
Do you have some more questions
right.
here?
Yes, was it Einstein, or I think he said that compound interest was, one of the wonders of the world, or something like that. But yeah, I mean, because your money compounds when you earn interest, because then you earn interest on your interest.
Yeah.
Peter, where do credit unions fit in all this? Are they in just as deep as the banks, or are they a less risky option?
Well, I mean, I guess it's a case by case basis, but most of those credit unions probably made mortgage loans or something. I mean, again, the money doesn't sit there; they loan it out. They do stuff with it, and and as a result, I mean, they're in bad shape.
How about this one? Thoughts on large banks utilizing the temporary backstop created in the wake of SVB?
Yeah, well, they've closed that facility now, but they're allowing the banks that borrowed the money initially, they don't have to pay it back. The way it was first conceived, the loans were going to come due. And now the Fed is saying, well, you don't have to pay the money back. Well, you can roll it over, which is what I thought was going to happen in the beginning. I knew they were lying because I knew that the banks would have no ability to repay these loans, which is why they're not doing it. But again, where did the money come from? It came from the inflation. And that's one of the reasons that inflation is not going down to 2%. That's why oil prices, they're up 15% so far this year. It doesn't sound like 2% inflation. And all the data that you see shows that prices are starting to accelerate again.
Peter, you just said, and I remember when we spoke last time, you said they aren't going to have to pay it back. Joe, if you could find that slide with the bank term funding program where, when they implemented it, I think it was when they ended it, I think there was loans on the books of like $165 billion or something like that. But it was interesting because what you just said, these banks probably knew that they were going, it's like the PPP, right, on a massive scale, because they were arbitraging this money, the banks, and making money. And so, but it was interesting because it started to taper off. And then in like November of 23, it shot straight back up again, where the banks just went straight back to the well and gobbled up as much money as they could get from, the Fed. And now it seems like, and he's probably going to pull it up.
But this problem didn't come out of left field. I was warning about this for 10 years. I was saying when the Fed had rates at 0% and the banks were, writing all these 30-year mortgages at 3%, I was warning back then that this was a disaster in the making, because everybody was looking at it from the perspective of the borrower. Oh, this is great. Americans are refinancing their mortgages, and they used to pay 7% and 8%, and now they're paying 3%. And I said, yeah, that's great for the borrower, but what about the bank? Because the bank used to earn 8%, and now it's only earning 3%. Well, when the Fed had interest rates at 0, it was okay for the banks, because they were still making money because they were borrowing for nothing and collecting 3%. But I kept saying, what's going to happen when interest rates go up? The banks will be insolvent, which they are, because they're paying 5% for their money and they're earning 3% on it. So they're losing money on every mortgage they've written. And the decline in the value of those mortgages and the treasuries that they also own, because they're so levered up, the market loss has wiped out more than 100% of their capital. So all these banks are insolvent, but they're pretending not to be, because they claim that all these bonds are going to be held to maturity and all these mortgages are going to be held to maturity. But you don't always have the ability to hold a long-term asset to maturity if your customers want their money back. That's what happened to Silicon Valley Bank. The customers wanted their money back, and so these long-term held to maturity assets had to be sold. And the value had collapsed, and so the banks fail.
Let's look at that chart. Pull it up here, Joe. I know you had it up there. Can you make that any bigger on just that line, or no? There we go. So this is back in that March 12th weekend when we first saw SVB collapse, and they came up with this emergency funding program. But here's what I was talking about. You can see that straight line up where the banks just went in and borrowed money, and then it kind of leveled out. And then all of a sudden at the end of last year, I mean, maybe they were learning that they weren't going to have to ultimately, maybe there was some talk going, hey guys, you're not going to have to give this money back. Is that possible, Peter, that there was chatter going on about it and then they just dove in?
Yeah, or they wanted to borrow some money while they could. Although, if there's another crisis, the Fed is going to, do the same thing. They don't learn from their mistakes. They just repeat them, usually on a bigger scale.
How about jobs? I mean, where do you see, Bloomberg, which I was really surprised to see this article. Bloomberg.com came out with, President Joe Biden is regularly promoting signs of a strengthening economy and easing inflation. But when it comes to the indicator closest to home, it's a tough sell. The surge in grocery prices since just before COVID lockdown has been stunning, up more than 25%, a full 5 percentage points more than consumer prices overall. Supermarket sticker shock. And I think everybody is feeling that. I think a lot of, every day, certainly our younger population, I think a lot of them are putting their groceries on credit cards. They're unable to pay it off.
Look, credit card debt is at an all-time record high, and credit card interest rates are at an all-time record high. So that is a particularly heavy burden to have to pay record high interest on a record high balance. But the idea that we have a strong labor market, that we have this low rate of unemployment, and we're creating all these jobs, that's one of the biggest lies that's being told by the Biden administration and by the media. We don't have a strong labor market. We have a very weak labor market. Yes, we are creating jobs, but we're not creating jobs that people want. We're creating jobs that people unfortunately need, that they would prefer not to have. See, what's happened is that we've had a net loss of full-time jobs over the course of the Biden administration. And in fact, all the jobs that he claims credit for having created were the jobs that existed before he was president. But they were on hold because we shut the economy down, right? So employers, had laid people off temporarily, and then they were recalled when we reopened the economy. And Biden likes to, blame Trump for those job losses and claim credit for the job creation, when no jobs were actually lost or created, right? So it's all a hoax. But apart from that, there have been no full-time jobs created over the last several years. We've created a lot of part-time jobs to replace the full-time jobs. And that's one of the main reasons that the jobs numbers are so high, is because people are getting 2 or 3 jobs apiece. And so the jobs numbers don't make a distinction between part-time or full-time or how many jobs are going to the same person. And moonlighting is now at an all-time record high. We've never had a period in our history where you've had so many people working multiple jobs. Now, most people would prefer not to have 3 jobs. They would rather have 1 job and more leisure. The reason they have to resort to multiple jobs is because 1 job doesn't pay the rent. 1 job doesn't put food on the table the way it used to. So the labor market is so weak that wages have lost so much value that workers have no choice but to work additional jobs. And Biden wants to take credit for those additional jobs. The workers want to blame him for the fact that they have to work those jobs. And of course, maybe a guy had a full-time job where he was making $150,000 a year with benefits, and now he has 2 or 3 part-time jobs where he's making $70,000 a year collectively with no benefits. Biden is like, well, that's a success because I've created 2 jobs, right? He used to have 1 job, now he's got 3, and he's going to take credit for the 2 jobs. But the guy is not better off. And then, of course, even the unemployment numbers, they don't tell the truth because they don't count people who are working a part-time job but who would prefer a full-time job. In fact, if you have a part-time job, if you work 1 hour a week, but for the rest of the week you're looking for a job, you're not counted as unemployed. Also, if you've been looking for work for more than a year, you're not counted as unemployed, which is like ridiculous. But after a full year, you drop out of the statistics. So all the people who have been unemployed for 2, 3, 4, 5 years, they don't count. They drop out, but they're unemployed. So the whole statistic is a lie, right? So when we say, oh, look how low the unemployment rate is, yeah, it's because there's so many unemployed people who we're not even counting. And then I think one of the reasons that the unemployment claims are low is because a lot of people who lose a job can't qualify for unemployment. I mean, if you have 3 jobs and you lose 1, you're still working. You can't get unemployment. You have to have no job to get unemployment. So when somebody with multiple jobs loses a job, they're not getting unemployment. Plus, there are a lot of people who don't even have jobs. They just drive Ubers or something. Well, you can't get fired from an Uber job. You're an independent contractor. And so a lot of those, people in the gig economy, they may be, earning less money because they're not, getting as many rides or whatever it is, but they're not getting an unemployment check. So there's a lot of other reasons for the low unemployment claims. But also part of it is, I think the numbers are just made up. I mean, every month we get the number of jobs that was created. And then the next month, the government revises it and takes away 50 or 100,000 jobs. Oh, we didn't actually create them. But then they have another big number. And the media reports the big number. And then the following month, they revise that number down. So it's not so big anymore. Then they come up with another big number that gets revised down. Right? So it's all this kind of game that they play so the media can talk about all these jobs that were created. And they never go back and report that all those jobs that they reported were created a month ago. It turns out they didn't even exist. So I think the numbers are a farce. And in fact, if you remember, the 2008 recession, the Great Recession that began in December of 2007 and ended in early 2009. It was a very long recession. But they didn't call that recession officially until December of 2008. And they went back and they said, you know what? We have been in recession for the past year. So all the numbers that we've been coming out with were wrong. The government went back and revised them all down and said, we were telling you we had this good economy. It was actually wrong. We were actually in a recession the entire time. And all these jobs that we told you were being created, it turns out that none of them were actually created. We actually lost a bunch of jobs. So the numbers weren't even close to being accurate. And I actually think that after this election, they're finally going to come back and they're going to go back over the last couple of years and they're going to say, you know what? None of these jobs actually were created. And that's why, Biden is the most unpopular president in history. Oh, I mean, however long they've been doing these polls. And if you want to know where he gets his lowest marks, it's on the economy. That's where he scores lowest. So how can the economy be good if Biden is so unpopular? Because it's always the economy, stupid. The voter, if the voter feels that his personal situation has improved, he generally will credit that to the president. If, on the other hand, times are tough, he will blame the president, regardless, right, of whether he deserves the credit or the blame. Voters tend to, associate their lot with whoever's at the top of the government, president. And the fact that Biden is so unpopular is proof that all the rosy statistics are lies. Because if the economy was as good as the statistics claim, or the government claims, right? Statistics, figures lie and liars figure. Because I look at the statistics and I don't even see that they're as good as people claim. It's just the way they get represented. But if the economy was as strong as the Fed claims it is, as Biden claims it is, right, as Wall Street likes to claim it is, Biden would be a lot more popular than he is.
Well, I think that people they're feeling it. I mean, we talked about this, right? I mean, you could say, hey, it's sunny outside, but you can look out your window and see that it's clearly pouring down rain. And if you walk out to your car, you're drenched, but yet they are telling you it's sunny. Eventually, you're going to say it's not sunny. And I think people.
Yeah, that's what I always said. Look, it's like, the government tells me it's sunny and I look out the window and I can see it's raining. I'm going to take an umbrella. I mean, I'm not going to just accept the government's word when I can see that they're wrong, and to me, the umbrella is, owning gold and silver, having the type of portfolio that we're creating for people at Euro Pacific Asset Management, right? I'm not believing these government weathermen when they tell me that it's a sunny day. I know that it's not, and I'm going to take precautions.
Do you think the government, I mean, I know Melissa has some questions here, but do you think the government will ever get to a point, Peter, where they would forbid you or make it illegal to own gold?
I don't know. I mean, they did for a while, unbelievably. I mean, as unconstitutional as that was, they did it. But, when they did that, we were still on a gold standard. And in fact, when Roosevelt initially, ordered people to come and turn in their gold, which, they didn't send government agents to people's house to collect their gold. I mean, people turned in their gold. They brought it to the government. A lot of people didn't do that and nothing happened to them. But after people turned in their gold, because, they were told to do it, they said it's the patriotic thing to do. So people gave the government an ounce of gold, and the government gave them 20 Federal Reserve notes, right? And once the government got everybody's gold, it said, okay, now that gold that we gave you $20 for, it's now worth $35. So the government did that to devalue the money so it could spend it, to so-called fight the depression. But we don't have to do that anymore. The government doesn't need our gold. It just prints money, right? Back then, it needed the gold because we were on a gold standard. Now, if the government wants money, it just prints it. So it steals our purchasing power, without having to do anything. So they're not going to outlaw gold. When they might do it is if we really do have a monetary collapse. And if it turns out that the government doesn't have as much gold in Fort Knox as they claim, although they should have more, maybe the government will claim it's some kind of a national emergency. And all the citizens who have gold need to turn it into the government because the government needs the gold to back up the currency. And, they would have to pay you for it. I guess they would give you some quantity of Federal Reserve notes, but they will probably rapidly depreciate after you get them. But, gold is very hard for the government to take, because how do they know you have it?
Are they chipping it? Somebody said they're chipping it now. Is that true or not?
What do you mean? Putting chip?
Like putting a tracking chip in it or something?
Not that I know of.
Yeah.
But, the easiest thing to confiscate would be your stocks, your bonds, I mean, because that's all at a brokerage account, right? That's easy to find. They could even take your real estate, right? Because I mean, you can't, they know where it's right there, they can see it. But, I mean, if they start confiscating our property, we're in a lot of trouble.
Got a question here for you, Peter. Peter, what do you think about the Fed creating new leverage rules regarding their handling of treasuries? Seems like the banks are shifting the incoming QE to the banks to absorb the bond issuance.
Well, the banks buy treasuries. I mean, a lot of institutions buy treasuries because the government sells a lot of treasuries, which is unfortunate because that's money that can't be loaned to a business. Which is one of the reasons we have big trade deficits, because we don't have domestic savings going towards capital investment. We have it financing consumption through deficit spending. But this is all part of the bubble. It's all part of the bubble that's going to pop. And the way it's going to pop is through a collapse in the dollar.
Peter, how soon do you think we will see bank failures, and will it only be the regional banks or big ones?
Well, I think all the banks would fail if the government did the right thing. But because I'm confident that the government's going to do the wrong thing, no banks may fail. I mean, there's going to be some. I mean, it's not going to be, but the government's not going to let the depositors lose money. They probably won't even let the bondholders lose money. I mean, maybe the equity holders. But again, just because you don't lose money doesn't mean you don't lose if your money ends up losing value. Because you don't want your money. You want what you can buy with your money. And when the government has to bail out all these banks, you're not going to be able to buy much with your money.
And we're probably close to that, Peter. I mean, right? I mean, you think about all this, we're not hearing it. I mean, 40% of the commercial loans, I think, are coming for refinance this year. But yet no one's talking about, we don't hear anybody talking about the fact that real estate, the commercial real estate, in a lot of cases is now worth pennies and nickels and dimes on the dollar.
Oh, I mean, it is a perfect storm. And again, I was warning about this years ago. It's not like, if you were just thinking rationally, you could have seen this coming. I mean, it's not like I'm just super smart. I mean, I was just thinking it through. And I knew that commercial real estate was trading off of 0% interest rates, because commercial real estate is like a bond. That's how it's valued. It has a cap rate. And when interest rates are zero, your rental income has a much higher value than when interest rates are higher. And so I knew that the prices that were being paid for commercial real estate was absurd. It was a bubble in commercial real estate, just like there was a bubble in bonds. But nobody recognized it was a bubble because they just related it to bonds without realizing that the bond was a bubble, right? But then something else happened to commercial real estate, and that was COVID and work from home. And all of a sudden, all of this office space was no longer needed. And so the rental incomes collapsed because all these office buildings have high vacancies. And at the same time, you had WeWork, which was running around renting all this space that went bankrupt. I mean, WeWork is like the largest tenant in most of the major cities, and it's bankrupt, and all that real estate is for sublease. And you also, at the same time, Americans more and more were shopping on the internet. And so retailers can't make that much money when everybody's buying stuff on Amazon. And so, a lot of these shopping centers and malls, have high vacancies. So the income is down, and now the income that is worth less because the interest rates are higher. So a lot of these commercial real estate buildings, as a result of falling rental income and rising rates, are down 50, 60, 70, 80% from what people paid. Now, most people buying $100 million, $200 million, $500 million real estate, they weren't paying for it with cash. I mean, they put maybe 25% down, 30% down. They borrowed the rest. And maybe the investments cash flowed because they were borrowing at such a low rate. But now their income has collapsed because of vacancies and their financing costs have skyrocketed. And now they're negative cash flow. Meanwhile, the loans are due. There's a balloon payment after 5 years or 7 years. They thought, oh, I'll just refinance. Well, they can't refinance. So they're walking away from their obligations. And instead of paying the bank the $200 or $300 million that they owe them, they're just giving them $50 million worth of real estate because that's all that's left of the value. And so the real estate investors have lost money and the banks have lost even more money on the bad real estate loans.
And, if you think about these anchor stores, the grocery stores, that you just said it, people are shopping from home. When you go in the grocery store, first of all, besides the fact that you see no cashiers anymore, you now have to check yourself out. You have one person watching 6 people.
Yeah, and there's another problem. There's another problem in the cities, and that's crime. I mean, crime is now rampant. That a lot of these stores in the cities can't survive because people are just showing up and stealing everything. And so now they have to nail everything down. Everything is locked up. Their insurance rates have gone through the roof. So, I mean, a lot of these stores have to shut down because of the crime. And even some of the office buildings now, the employers don't even want to be there because they don't want their employees to risk coming to work and getting mugged. So you have that epidemic of crime, which started with the George Floyd stuff and the defund the police, and then all these cities deciding to decriminalize crime, where like we're not going to arrest you for shoplifting. So all of a sudden it's like, okay, well then I'm going to shoplift.
You go into around here and not far from our office, there's a Walgreens right down the street. I've said it on my show before. I went in to get some deodorant and it was like I was some kind of a criminal. I had to push the button and get help for them to come and unlock so I could get some speed stick and all over the intercom. Customer service needed in the personal hygiene department. And it went on this machine. I guess you have to re-push the button to disable it. And every 3 minutes or so, this loudspeaker, and here I am standing there.
And then meanwhile, you go to these other countries. I've been to countries in Europe where it's on the honor system. I mean, you just go in there and, you take the stuff, you run it through the scanner yourself, and you just pay. And people are honest. And we got a nation of a bunch of criminals. I mean, the reason that most people don't steal is because it's wrong. That's why you don't steal. But a lot of Americans, the only reason they don't steal is because they don't want to get caught. They have no morals. They'll steal if they know they can get away with it. And that's the problem. And I think that's a byproduct of the welfare state that we've created, where people think they're owed something. People think that society owes them something, and they're entitled to stuff. I mean, that's this whole like reparations movement where people are, oh, I'm entitled to this. And so if you feel entitled to stuff, well, then I'll just go take it. I mean, if I deserve reparations, why should I have to wait for the government to give me the reparations I deserve? I'm just going to go take it. And in fact, that's what really welfare is. The government is stealing from other people and giving you what they stole. And so once you accept the morality of that, it's okay to steal, if the government is doing the stealing. Well, why can't I just cut out the middleman? If it's okay for me to vote somebody into office who steals stuff and gives it to me, why can't I just go to the victim and steal it myself? Why do I have to have the government, taking a good chunk of the money? Because it's very inefficient. When the government steals from Peter to pay Paul, Paul doesn't get as much as they stole from Peter because the bureaucracy is very expensive. So the criminal might think, look, I'm going to cut out the middleman and I'll get a lot more money.
Well, the cashier that ended up helping me, that was by herself working every customer in the store at the time, or it would appeared to be, said that, I said, this is crazy. You're locking up deodorant. She said, yeah, people will come into the store with a bag and literally fill it up and walk out. And she said anything less than $1,000, we can't do anything about it. The police won't even, you can't even call the police. So it's when you say what you're saying is we're seeing it. And that's
and Amazon doesn't have this problem, right? Because when you buy, Amazon doesn't have to worry about theft. Although eventually they might start robbing the trucks, the UPS trucks and stuff like that. People might start, stealing the stuff there. But all this stuff, benefits Amazon because, they don't have any of those costs.
And people are getting more and more lazy. They don't want to go in stores anymore. And I can see where even these anchor stores, you think that they're great for this, community center, but they're going to move their businesses to less expensive areas because they can ship everything. And so these centers that you're talking about, the commercial real estate, it's not going to get better. I don't think. I think it's just going to continue to
and especially when the dollar collapses and all the stuff that the stores are selling that's imported is going to be so much more expensive.
They're not buying it. I mean, Home Depot's not big. Lowe's. See, I walked into Home Depot and I've been talking about this. And just this past weekend, I went into Home Depot and I said to the cashier, I said, man, it is probably the slowest. I'm a contractor. It's probably the slowest I've seen in a Home Depot store. And she said to me, I don't mind. Like, what? You don't mind? I mean, you might mind when your job is no longer needed. Yeah. I mean, do you think, Peter, and I know as we will wind down and answer some of these final questions, do you think we're going to see a massive job loss around the corner?
Yeah, look, I think the job losses are coming. I mean, again, I think we have them now. They just are not getting reported. But I think they're going to become a lot more numerous, and more of them are going to show up. And again, I think they're going to revise down the statistics of the past, and so they'll tell us after the fact that not nearly as many jobs were created as they initially reported. So yeah, I mean, there's no question that this is going to happen because, a lot of our jobs are a function of consumption, people spending money. Well, people are only spending money because they can get more credit, because they're able to borrow more money. Well, when they can't borrow more money, the spending stops. And when the spending stops, all the jobs associated with that spending go away.
Yeah, the deficit spending will catch up.
And if it's not the credit that runs out, if the dollars crash, and so I can't buy anything, I can't afford anything with my dollars, then the jobs go away for that reason too.
Which is a big warning to people out there that are buying houses in our industry, people that are buying houses and they can't afford it and they're pushing and stretching and everything else. And these, the loan officers with this date to rate, marry the house kind of scenario, saying that you can always refinance later. I mean, with what Peter's saying, we will probably see interest rates go up. We may see some kind of a downturn here in a short term, because we're in this election cycle, and they will try and probably pull out every bag of tricks that they possibly can between now and November. But eventually this has to catch up. And when the government is not lending money anymore, and you're expecting private sector to actually, buy these mortgage-backed securities, and we start seeing this impact on commercial banks, which is going to happen, the only way that they can pay for it is to raise rates and have inflation. It's not going to work in the opposite way. They've really kind of backed themselves in the corner. So let's take a couple more questions. And by the way, guys, I mean, look, so grateful of Peter's time and being on this channel. And he's just a wealth of knowledge. And, we can look at it in different ways. You can stick your head in the sand and you can say that what he is saying is not true. And you can just turn on mainstream media. And I'm not saying that everything that Peter believes that you should believe, but I think, guys, we really need to have open our ears, open our eyes, open our minds to different, schools of thought, because the path we're currently going down is not sustainable. And I think that the biggest thing that we can take away from this is look at yourself. Look at your debt. Look at how much your money isn't buying today that it bought 4 or 5 years ago. This is how quick this has happened. But
Yeah.
all of Peter's information is in the show notes below. I encourage you to check him out. Visit his websites, learn more from Peter, go to his YouTube channel, subscribe to his channel. He does a live show. Peter, how many times a week do you do a live show?
Well, it's usually twice a week, sometimes once, sometimes 3 times. It just depends on what's happening and how much free time I have. But yeah, people have to think for themselves, think outside the box, and recognize that the way things were is not necessarily the way things are going to be. A lot of people got caught up in the stock market during the 1960s. It was a big bull market. It was the Nifty 50. It was, the Xerox and the Polaroid and all these stocks that were the Nvidias of their day, they got crushed in the 1970s. They got obliterated. So if you took the 1960s stock portfolio into the 1970s, you got destroyed. But if you saw the writing on the wall and understood it, and you had a portfolio of gold stocks, of oil stocks, if you bought stocks in Japan, if you bought stocks in Germany, you made a lot of money in the 1970s as the dollar lost 2/3 of its value, as gold went from 35 to 800, as oil went from $3 to $30. So I think there's something similar now. I think too many people are going to be stuck in the portfolios of the past. I think we're going to have an even bigger dollar devaluation than we had in the 70s. And so I think the people that are invested properly in the foreign stocks, the emerging markets, the commodities, I think they're going to do even better than people did in the 70s. And, I've been preparing people for this in advance. I mean, some people say too far in advance because, when you understand what's going to happen, you can see it long before it happens. And a lot of people think that because you saw it so early, you're wrong. You're not wrong. It's the people who don't see it that are wrong. They said the same thing to me about the housing bubble and the financial crisis, which I was calling for years and years. I really started writing about it and warning about it in 2002, and it didn't crash until 07, 08. But I wasn't wrong for 5 years. I was right. It's everybody else that was wrong. They thought it was real. They didn't understand what was going to happen. I did. Well, this is an even bigger bubble, and it's gone on for even longer. But the consequences are going to be even more severe. And that's why it's even more important that you prepare. And fortunately, there's enough foolish people out there that you can still do it. You can buy gold and silver cheap. You can get rid of your dollars before the crash. You can accumulate the right type of portfolio. So again, that's what we're doing. So give us a call or reach out at Euro Pacific Asset Management. Europath.com is the website. Talk to one of my advisors. If you're a do-it-yourselfer, I have a mutual fund family. All my mutual funds are available. There's a no-load version. If you're not sure, you can go to the website Europath.com and look up my funds. But I have a gold fund, an emerging market fund, an international value fund, an international dividend payer fund, and a foreign bond fund. You can buy them through Schwab, Fidelity, E-Trade, Ameritrade, wherever you have your discount account. Or if you want some help, talk to my brokers. You can even buy the funds directly on my website. If you don't even have a brokerage account, you can just invest in my funds. If you have more money, you can set up a separately managed account. You can transfer over an IRA or a pension account, and we can manage it for you in the right portfolio. And as I said, if you don't have any gold or silver, you should buy some before the price goes much higher. Schiff Gold is my company. Just my name, schiffgold.com. And there's phone numbers there. You could call up and talk to one of the representatives. In fact, they're probably around. These guys work hard. A lot of times they work nights. So if you call, somebody might just pick up, and you can actually place an order and get some gold and silver.
Yeah. All right, let's take 2 more questions. How about that?
That sounds good to me. Peter, what do you think the prognosis is for the middle class? Do people just keep getting poorer until the government has absorbed all wages via inflation?
Well, the middle class is getting hollowed out. I mean, what it means to be middle class now, I mean, it's a lot less than what it was. Biden likes to say that, the workers are responsible for growth in the economy, that the government or the labor unions created the middle class. Capitalism created the middle class. I mean, the middle class didn't exist until the free market created it. It was a lack of government. It was the productivity of a free economy that gave rise to the middle class, which at one point was, uniquely American. Every other country had some rich people and a bunch of poor people. The middle class was an American phenomenon at one point. But what it means to be middle class now. I mean, middle class at one time was a guy didn't even need to go to college. A guy had a job and he could support his wife who didn't have to work. He could support 3 or 4 kids. He didn't have any credit card debt. He didn't have an auto loan. He was able to save for retirement. You can have a nice lifestyle in America and have a lot of consumer goods and have a decent standard of living with a blue collar paycheck. Now, people, can barely afford kids, even if they have a husband and wife both working, and now they have to work multiple jobs. A lot of people, can barely afford kids. A lot of couples, don't even have kids, or they wait until their 30s or their 40s or older to have kids because they can't afford them in their 20s like their grandparents could. And they're loaded up with debt. They have no savings. They have credit card debt. They have student debt. They have auto debt, mortgage debt. They have nothing. They have no real way to ever retire. Most people think they're going to retire on Social Security, which they're not. I mean, that's a government Ponzi scheme. I've been talking about Bitcoin as a Ponzi. Well, I mean, the ultimate Ponzi is Social Security. My father wrote in his book, wrote a book, The Social Security Swindle. He wrote that the Social Security Administration should erect the statue of Ponzi, to adorn the lobby of their building, because they based the whole program off of Ponzi. And Ponzi schemes are illegal because they don't work. And just because the government is running the Ponzi scheme doesn't change that. I mean, governments can keep a Ponzi going a lot longer because they could do it by force, because they can force you to participate in the Ponzi scheme. Ponzi couldn't do that. Bernie Madoff, he had to fool people. But once people realized it was a Ponzi, they didn't want to participate. But even if Social Security is a Ponzi scheme, the taxes still come out of your pay. So they can keep it going for a long time. But eventually the whole thing collapses. Either the government is not going to pay the Social Security benefits, or it's going to pay them in worthless money because of inflation.
And what a lot of people don't realize, Peter, is it's double, right? So it's that 7.65% that you're paying on your income, and your employer is actually not paying you as much as you could be paid because they're contributing.
That's another way they misrepresent this to the public. The government acts as if you're getting something for nothing. They say, hey, the payroll tax is 15% between Social Security and Medicare, but you're only paying 7. Your employer is paying the other 7. No, you're paying all 15. Because if your employer didn't send that money to the government, he would give it to you. Because when you get a job, you have to deliver enough productivity to cover your total cost of employment, which includes all of the payroll taxes that your employer pays as a result of hiring you. Now, I'm indifferent. If I hire somebody, I just assume give the money to the worker than the government, but the worker's productivity has to cover the whole thing. And so in the absence of Social Security, workers' pay would rise by the total amount of their Social Security payments, both the ones that they made and the ones made on their behalf by their employer. So the employer isn't paying. He's just deducting the money from your pay and sending it to the IRS. So you pay the whole thing. And you see that because if you're self-employed, you pay the whole thing directly, right? There's no way to pretend that you're getting something for nothing. But when Social Security first started, self-employment income was exempt. So if you were self-employed, you paid nothing. That didn't even start, I think, until the 50s. But the reason when they originally started Social Security in the 30s, the reason that it didn't apply if you were self-employed is the government thought, well, if you're smart enough to be self-employed, you're smart enough to save for your retirement. The purpose of Social Security was the government claimed that some people were too dumb to save for their own retirement, that some people who had jobs just were not sophisticated enough to save any money. And so the government was going to do it for them. But then the government took their money and spent it all. That's the other lie of Social Security. The government doesn't save any of the money. It all gets spent. The only thing they have to show for your Social Security payment is a government IOU, as a treasury bond. But that doesn't show how much money the Social Security has. It's how much money it's spent, because the government owes Social Security all the money that it's spent, which means it's not there. It's an IOU nothing, right? I can't write myself a check and then claim that check is an asset. Of course it's not. It's also a liability, because I'm the obligor of that check, right? So if I write myself $1 million check, that doesn't mean I'm a millionaire.
And by the way, they make the age long older, for your retirement, and you can't live on it anyway. So, that it's true. If it was true that they would take this money, take it from you so that you would be assured to be able to retire and not be a burden to somebody, it failed because you can't live on Social Security and Medicare. So, all right, one more question.
One more.
All right.
This is it for the night. Peter, I know you believe in silver and gold. What about the other metals such as platinum? Also, could a gold-backed blockchain relegate silver to only industrial use, suppressing the price?
Yeah, well, platinum is cheap. One time platinum was more expensive than gold. Now it's like half the price of gold. So, yeah, in fact, you can buy platinum at Schiff Gold as well. We have, platinum coins and bars. I think all metals are going to go up. Copper, nickel, zinc. But, gold's a lot easier to store because you get a lot more value in a smaller space. But yes, I do think that to the extent that we are going to go on a gold standard again one day and use blockchain or some other way of transacting, it does kind of take away the purpose of silver, because if I'm tokenizing gold, then I can break gold down into fractions of a gram, and I can use gold for every transaction. So I don't need a lesser value metal like silver or nickel or copper to buy small things. I could just spend small quantities of gold, which are impractical when there's physical gold. If I had a gram of gold that's very small, I could easily lose it, right? And so you're not going to have you can't use gold to buy a pack of chewing gum. But if I've tokenized it, yeah, I can buy one stick. There's no limit to the small quantity. So that could somewhat cause silver to be more of an industrial metal. But I think there'll always be a demand for a monetary unit that is not traceable, that is not trackable. So anything that's going to be done through a computer, the governments are going to be able to monitor it, tax it, whatever. And so to the extent that people want to be able to transact with one another anonymously, or in a way that Big Brother isn't spying on them and doesn't know what they're doing, silver is a great way to pay for those transactions. So silver could still be used as money for transactions that people want to enter into, directly with one another in a way that might be anonymous. Not necessarily because they're criminals, but because they just don't want the government to know everything that they're doing.
All right, and I just have one final question, Peter. What's the Fed going to do? They're going to pass on lowering rates, or do you think we're going to see a drop in interest rates this month?
Well, the markets are expecting interest rates to be cut, and so the Fed rarely disappoints the markets. It's an election year. I think that Biden's chances of winning are improved if the Fed cuts rates before the election. And so that's another reason that I think Powell might do that, because I think Powell would prefer to see Biden reelected. And I think that's the Fed's goal. That's always their goal. If Trump was president, he would be trying to reelect Trump. They generally try to help whoever's in power at the time. So rates are probably going to get cut. They're probably not going to get cut as much as people had hoped for. And the Fed shouldn't be cutting rates. They should be raising rates, because inflation is a lot higher than they claim. And they need to raise rates much more because they have to cut back on the borrowing. So far rates have gone up, but it hasn't stopped people from borrowing. Credit card debt is at record highs. Household debt is at record highs. Government debt is at record highs. Deficits are records. And so inflation is going to continue. The Fed has to raise rates high enough to stop all that borrowing and spending. But if they did that, we'd have not only a depression, we'd have financial crisis. I mean, it'd be a collapse. So the Fed isn't going to do it. But that means inflation is going to be here indefinitely, and it's going to get a lot worse.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, there is Peter Schiff. Peter, we thank you so much for your time. And everybody, again, all of Peter's information, his company's information is in the show notes. Cruise on over, subscribe to his channel. I'm telling you, he puts out great content. Thank you, sir.
Yeah. All right. Great. Thanks for having me on. Good night, everybody.
Thank you, Peter. We'll have to do this again.
All right.